Municipal IQ economist Karen Yese joins us now. Good evening, Karen. Thanks very much for your time. From what you've been, or the information that you've been able to gather, was 2018 the worst year for service delivery, or was it a year in which there were perhaps more protests more than anything else?
Good evening. That's a very interesting question. I think the answer is yes, to some extent, on both counts. So on the one hand, clearly local government did have a series of crises and problems. You had a lot of municipalities being put under administration. You had issues like Eskom threatening to cut many municipalities. So service delivery really was a problem. Were service delivery protests a representation of that failure? I think there were other issues that we see. So it was definitely a peak as far as our records were concerned. But in many instances, what communities were asking for seemed to be correlated with issues of economic recession and unemployment. So often communities were asking for employment creation by municipalities, which is quite a long interpretation of the mandate for local government, and to an extent can't really be laid at the feet of local government. So a little bit in both directions. There was a service delivery issue, but protests reflected wider, especially financial concerns. So
the recession and unemployment are the other issues that you were referring to.
Absolutely. So clearly, in many instances, we can trace a service delivery concern that gets raised by communities. But the one that's really over the last 2 years come to the fore is the expectation of municipalities to create jobs, or unhappiness when there are projects underway, but there's a sense that nepotism or corruption has come into those processes.
Well, I mean, community engagement is a requirement in, local government administration and the politics of that space. From your research, do your councillors sort of go to the communities to actually explain such issues? I mean, why would they want to be crucified for something that is, or things that are outside their mandate, for example? Do they make an effort to actually engage with communities, especially around issues that have nothing to do with their mandate?
I think that's a very important issue, and it's really the key to dealing with service delivery protests is more engagement and more communication. Clearly, in many instances, there's unhappiness with a councillor, and that's expressed, but there are very many good councillors in South Africa who work hard. The problem that they face is often they don't get enough information from the council administrations. Also, the problem is often an intergovernmental issue, especially when we're looking at something like housing. So it's quite interesting. One of the key themes for 2018 was a drop in service delivery protests in Gauteng, relatively speaking. In previous years, we always saw Gauteng being the most protest-afflicted province, and it dropped to third place. And perhaps the answer there was that we had a concerted intergovernmental effort, the war room solution in Susano. And perhaps, that really speaks to the sort of multilateral solutions that are needed to service delivery problems.
Now, how conscious are the other spaces? I don't know if your research gets into that as well. I'm talking here about provincial and national government, about what is going on and how inevitably this atmosphere, and if this atmosphere continues, I mean, this is bound to spill over into the election period that is already upon us, if the last story we did is anything to go by.
It's very interesting to look at election trends, because there are some clear trends. The first really strange one, perhaps, is that we actually see service delivery protests going down during local government elections, and that's because local politicians tend to spend more time in communities, and that actually subdues service delivery protests. Unfortunately, the opposite is true of general elections, provincial and national elections. We see service delivery protests rise, and perhaps again that's because politicians are in communities, but they're making promises that they don't have to deliver on as national or provincial candidates. So it is a concern that the political tenor and expectations will rise around the time of elections, and there's extrapolating from the last two general elections, there's a good chance that we will see service delivery protests rising even further this year.
I know that during national and provincial elections, we tend to focus a lot on issues like health, issues like education, and so on. But if this has been the trend, and 2018, as your report says, was the worst year for service delivery and protests around that, how likely are we going to see local government issues then taking a center stage, even during a provincial and national government election?
Well, there are two key issues. The one we already saw arising last year in a number of protests, and that's around land. There's an expectation that land must be freed up. The pressure is clearly greatest in urbanized area, and Ekurhuleni has already expressed an interest and appetite for land expropriation for communities. So it's quite likely that we'll see the land issue and issues of human settlements and more equitable human settlements coming to the fore in local government. The other one, which is a very complex one, and it remains with us as an intergovernmental issue, is housing. So housing, in the case of large metros, is delivered by local government, but clearly undertakings are likely to be made in various election mandates and campaigns around that.
Okay, Karen, thanks very much for your time this evening. She is an economist with Municipal IQ, taking us through a report they have, which shows that 2018 was the worst year in as far as service delivery protests